This is Ryan Buckner with Schellman. Or am I really? The question is important because it speaks to identity and trust. Well, I can think of no better person to have a conversation about digital identity and trust than Scott Perry. Scott is a subject matter expert in this space, and he is Schellman's crypto and digital trust leader. Scott, welcome to the Truth Series.
Oh, it's great to be here.
Outstanding. So I've got no notes. I've got no questions. Instead, I want to talk a little bit about digital trust and identity, and not in terms of how does one sign up for it or where does one go to get these types of services, but I want to talk a little bit about trust in general, about what it means to be a person or an entity online and how those two work together. But before we do that, you're Scott Perry. How long have you been in this space?
Well, it's been a long journey for me, actually. And it actually started in the mid-1990s. I was working for a large CPA firm, and I was the external auditor for Microsoft when they were debating whether they should embrace the internet or not.
That's right.
And decided to take a flyer and get invested in the technology, and I became the e-commerce security leader at the time.
That sounds exciting, especially for the mid-90s, you said, right?
Right, because there were some standards that were just coming about, and actually ran a project for the state of California for implementing new digital signature legislation.
That's right.
And so I got the bug and was excited about my career journey when it somehow came about where the infrastructure and the public didn't want to pay for the cost of securing the internet. And so, I was pretty much out of a job for quite a long time until 9/11. And at 9/11, that's when I got more involved in that. So after 9/11, the younger Bush administration implemented an act to require all agencies to use higher level digital identity certificates through more traditional legacy type X509 certificates in a smart card.
That's right.
And so that they can communicate with each other as well as communicate with government contractors.
That's right.
And so a government contractor in the Pacific Northwest I had a relationship with wanted to be the first organization to communicate with the federal government, actually the DoD.
That's right.
And so I won a contract to be the auditor to audit their certification authority,
That's right.
the body that issued those digital identity certificates.
That's right.
And they liked the work, and then gave my card out to a couple of other defense contractors, and I was in business because I had annual audits to secure that type of infrastructure, and got me pretty knowledgeable around the legacy use of cryptography.
That's right.
Eventually, I went on my own as a CPA firm, a small firm, but as a CPA firm, I could audit public certificate authorities, the ones that issue certificates to protect websites. And I became a Web Trust accredited auditor in that space. And Schellman was doing that as well. And so I've continued the legacy side with Schellman. But 7 years ago, we were realizing that the legacy technology with cryptography was not going to solve the user identity problem on the internet. It didn't scale, it was very costly, and it didn't work well with the citizenry. And so yet the components of cryptography that came out 7 to 8 years ago with Bitcoin and blockchain, it came up with a technological solution that could transform the way we are operating on the internet today.
So Scott, I've known you for some time now, and I can get away with asking you this question, all right? Rather than go through sort of the step-by-step on what digital identity is and what digital trust is, let's first start with, why do you care? Why should anyone care about digital identity and trust online?
Well, I like to say that I'm a person that wants to create fairness in the world. And to represent yourself inappropriately when you do transactions is something that, just gets into my craw, so to speak.
Understood.
The way we interact outside of the internet is different than the way we interact online. And that became very apparent during the pandemic.
Absolutely.
We were limited with what our personas were and the amount of technology between me and trusted parties that didn't trust who I was online because I didn't prove well enough that I was who I said I was in a given context. And that's the problem that exists today, because the technology and the payload needed to prove my individual identity was never built in to the protocol that communicates at the onset of the internet. So just, transactions pass from machine to machine.
That's right.
And it takes the receiver of transactions to then take that information and translate that into individual identity, which is insufficient, and it allows individuals to rely on tech partners to carry too much information about who I am.
That's right.
Which invades my privacy. So with the technology that has been invented and moved forward, we could create an architecture to allow for greater privacy, greater responsibility, and accountability and legitimacy of transactions that we do online. And once you allow that base to happen, just imagine what we can do with the internet. Because right now we're limited until we get that specific personal identity, attribute complete.
Now, you mentioned an interesting word there. You said context. Elaborate on that a bit more. You said during the pandemic, who you were online versus who you were offline. And then you mentioned context. Describe to us trust in context and how those two work together.
Yeah, so so a context is in a given situation. For example, something that we all know, we get a driver's license, okay? And yet that driver's license now in a physical world is used in another context to actually board a plane, past the TSA line.
That's right.
So the context that you use to get a driver's license requires, in the United States, a state to verify that you've passed the requirements to getting that driver's license. You've passed a test, a driver's test, a written test. You have a certain age requirement, and then maybe a citizenry requirement with the real ID requirements in the federal government space. Now they give you an identity artifact, physical. Okay. Now that's the context of which that credential has been issued to you. Now, how you use it in other contexts, they have to understand what was done to give them confidence that in another context, such as boarding a plane,
that's right,
the sufficient identity verification was done in another context so that I could use it for this context into boarding a plane.
That's right.
So it's important that the rules associated with the issuance of that original credential that you got has been identified, and also has been part of an accountability scheme that gives trust that that document that I'm using in another context is good for my purpose.
Accountability scheme, what do you mean by that?
We all live by sets of rules. And in our space, in the IT space, we are one of the arbiters within those schemes, okay? Sets of rules, a governing authority determines that they want to, issue a certain process happening, whether it's in PCI to issue payment credentials and transact payment activity. And you need to have the right to do that. And so the governing authority establishes rules associated with who would be allowed to have the right to participate in that payment ecosystem. So they set a number of rules, and participants that want to act in that, banks or merchants, have to subscribe against that certain rules. They have to assert that they are meeting those requirements.
Understood, absolutely.
And they need to hold themselves up to third parties because that creates greater trust. And as Schellman, we add value to trust by holding organizations that are subscribing against criteria
That's right.
accountable.
That's right.
Not only do they assert that they can meet it, but they have to demonstrate through evidence that they have to meet these things. Now, in the same thing that we're doing in PCI and other organizations and other schemes that we're working in, that is the milieu that will be in the digital identity ecosystem accountability scheme.
Digital accountability or digital identity accountability schemes, how many of them are there right now? Dozens, thousands, hundreds?
So, the technology, there have been legacy digital identity schemes and requirements. There are standards. The United States has a standard, NIST 863-3.
Okay.
In Canada, they're using the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. In the UK, they have two advisory standards called GPG 44 and GPG 45. So there are standards around proving your identity,
Right.
and being able to authenticate when you actually have your identity. How could I enact a transaction using it?
That's right. How mature are those schemes? I know you've been involved with at least two of those, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. So, they go back 10 years originally, okay? But the advancement of technology is changing these standards. Okay? So, the advance of cryptography, the cryptography isn't changing, so to speak, because we're still using the mathematical relationship between a secure private key
That's right.
and an available public key.
That's right.
It's where do we put it and how do we use the technology to advance the personal
Would you say
digital
the
identity.
technology is outpacing those rules or those schemes? Or is it a situation where a lot of the schemes are outdated at this point? Or where would you see the future, I should say, with respect to these accountability schemes?
Well, I do think that the technology is being developed. Now, the focus around the technology is around the advancement of a secure wallet.
Interesting.
Okay, because now we're at the point where a great majority of the public have a smartphone. We had to wait until that took place because now in your hand, you have the ability to secure. We use wallets today. They're not under the same regulations that will come in place when we're talking about digital identity artifacts. But we have used today, you have wallets. Apple has a wallet, Google has a wallet, and so forth.
That's right.
However, those are very specific purpose wallets, and they don't have a rule set that deals with the risk of your personal identity. And so once you add the risk of your personal identity, you have to have a set of schemes to allow for high assurance. You want to have high protection of your private key to enact transactions, and that has to be controlled. So those are new schemes that will be developed probably in the next year, advancing in the EU under a standard called EIDAS 2.0, as well as the development of new software proposed by the Linux Foundation under a project called the Open Wallet Foundation.
Open Wallet, interesting.
And so they're creating an open source code to compete with Google and Apple so that there will be a set of code that wallet providers or organizations that want to, store artifacts and extract artifacts for advanced applications in the future. So when you go back and say the tech is moving and the governance is moving, but it's based on the core set of cryptography, potentially blockchain, smartphones, and governance.
Got it.
How do you manage?
So you mentioned a couple jurisdictions there, or at least a couple of countries. The UK. You also mentioned Canada, the United States. Are those sort of the major players right now? The EU, Canada, and the United States, or are there others that are in the mix?
No, there's a number of countries that are bubbling up. I would say that what's advancing is Canada has a lot of activity, and Schellman has just become an accredited auditor under DIAC, which is the Digital Identity Accountability Council of Canada.
Okay.
And they're a business consortium that is trying to codify the set of controls under the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework.
What does that mean, if I can interrupt you? Schellman is an auditor under that framework. What is that? What's the practical application of that?
So if you want to demonstrate that you've met a certain standard, like the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework or attributes of that, and you want to get a trust mark to demonstrate that you have met that level of standard,
That's right.
You need to pass an audit.
Understood.
You need to demonstrate and provide evidence that you're proving that you're meeting the standard of privacy or identity proofing or other sets of criteria that DIAC will be promoting in the next year or two. And we are the auditor that would receive the evidence and examine the evidence to attest that a company's assertion that they are meeting the requirements of the Pan-Canadian Trust Framework are being met, so you could get that trust mark.
Got it.
And demonstrate to the public that you are meeting those minimum standards.
That's right. So while certain aspects of digital trust and identity may be new in certain respects, the paradigm of, hey, you can believe me or trust me, I'm doing what it is that I say that I do from an organizational standpoint, that's a well-worn path. And so whether it's PCI or ISO or any other assessment or certification, it's the exact same mechanism at play. It's just a different subject matter.
That's right. It's the basis of what we do.
That's right.
So, we are a participant of trust because an organization can say, well, Ryan, you're a guy, I like you. You can say whatever you are and I'm going to believe you. But if I have another person actually examine some of the statements that you've made, you're gaining more credibility
That's right.
in the marketplace.
That's right.
And so our reputation is key, that we maintain our conflicts of interest, that we demonstrate competence in the marketplace, and we are a leader in the digital identity and crypto space.
That's right.
And so companies can be comfortable with us being part of their trust decision that they make based on the fact that we are part of processes that issue these trust marks.
That's right.
Which will be key.
That's
and
right.
will be, and we've seen enough in the marketplace that is going to be, the pattern that will be rolled out globally around that. And we are going to be an active participant.
So Scott, your crystal ball may work slightly better than mine. So let's talk about the future a little bit and where we're headed. What do you think the future holds in the next 3 to 5 years with digital identity and trust?
So I've waited 7 years really on this. And it's interesting that, technology that requires global change takes a set pattern. You have to prove the tech. You have to promote the tech. You have to get the relying parties or players involved, governments, to accept the tech. So we've gotten to the point where governments are accepting the technology, that the standards are being built as we speak. We have organizations jockeying for position because there's profit to be made in the future using the technology. And so all the things are well positioned for now rollout. We've proven the technology with tests, and now we're seeing approvals to actually roll out this in an operational standpoint. And so I think you're going to see the ball starting to accelerate. And I would say you're going to see in the next 2 years some major business applications that will be using the technology, certain ones that need to happen earlier than others, foundational type of applications to happen. Mostly, could be driven by government. In the UK, they're driving it to digitally rent a place.
That's right.
Or be able to prove that you're the right person to work.
That's
You know,
right.
you prove your identity, so you have the right to work and the right to get a background check.
It sounds as though there isn't a particular or specific industry that this is for. It sounds like this is ubiquitous across all industries. Anytime you're hiring an employee or engaging in a contract, or do I have that wrong? Are there certain industries that you feel will adopt this, maybe earlier than other types of industries?
Well, I think you're dealing with higher risk-based applications and industries, ones that were waiting for greater trust processes to be put in place before they could allow higher risk transactions to happen. Where does that go? It probably in financial high tech areas where we're already exchanging cryptocurrency without necessarily identification of individuals that are doing it, because we have anti-money laundering laws out. How does this apply? How do we transact with individuals that are anonymous to us? So you need to know your customer and know the businesses that are being transacted in this. So I'd say in the financial world, that's going to be key. We see it in other aspects of blockchain, with supply chain as well, to identify transactions that are happening. I'd say we see a great deal around hiring and background check. So I'm working with an organization, an ecosystem that's the Internet of Careers.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so it takes 2 weeks to a month to background check a person, because background check organizations look at paper. And they have to get the paper, they have to validate that the paper is authentic, and be able to render a decision whether someone is really truthful about the artifacts that they provide. With this technology, you could speed that up to hours.
Wow.
Because you can immediately verify that the claims made by a hiring employee around their certifications, around their education, around their citizenry, around their ability to work, can be verified instantly.
Wow, that sounds like a significant value proposition. If I'm a CEO or a leader of an organization, what are the top 1, 2, or 3 things that they must know about digital identity trust? What should they be thinking about?
So they should be thinking about the realm of applications that they could create to their constituents if they absolutely had greater trust about those that are transacting it.
Got it.
Okay. So and think about what you're doing on paper today. I look at the whole education industry.
That's right.
And all the process associated with getting transcripts and getting digital diplomas or certifications. They're all claims of trust. They're all issuers saying, I want, this is a claim I'm making that you can trust.
That's right.
So if you're making a claim that you can trust, you need to have vehicles that allow that trust. And incorporating cryptography and a digital trust architecture that is being promoted is going to be something you need to be interested in.
Outstanding. It sounds as though that there's certainly a financial benefit to this, right? You can promote financial efficiency. Also from a operational efficiency standpoint, just eliminating as many steps, perhaps even some manual steps. And of course, there's going to be the risk management aspect of it as well. So it sounds like it's a clean sweep from operational and organizational efficiency and effectiveness endeavor. Definitely makes a lot of sense. Okay, Scott, so a lot of great things here discussed today, but bottom line it for me in this way. If you're a government entity or if you're part of the ecosystem of a government entity, what is the number one thing that you should be focused on with respect to digital identity and trust?
So we're seeing, organizations, countries that want to provide more value to their citizens. They want to be able to provide them avenues to provide services.
That's right.
that they use. However, they need to be able to trust that citizens won't take advantage of the the services that they're offering them.
That's right.
And so countries need to, generate rules
That's right.
associated with identity, not necessarily come up with, a specific identity that tracks all the people, because there could be harms associated with
Absolutely.
that. But in a way that's fair and inclusive. There's a wide variety of citizens in our world that are exempted from the digital economy. So come up with a scheme that is inclusive, that allows for the exchange of information in a privacy concerning way, so that individuals can control their own identity and give them the respect to operate in the new internet in a way that's going to enhance their lives.
That's right. And it sounds as though you don't have to start from scratch, whether it's DIAC or other of the players that you had mentioned. It sounds as though that there's already some of these schemes and frameworks that are in place that can be leveraged across the globe.
Right. And government should look at open source.
Yeah.
There's a lot of open source code that's available. Now, I was working with the Secretary of Commerce in the state of Rhode Island, and her initiative to create a CPA credential,
Interesting.
digitally signed by the state of Rhode Island, was done basically on open source code that was created by Hyperledger
Wow.
and advanced by the Trust Over IP Foundation, which Schellman is a steering committee member of.
Yeah. Well, now when you start talking about CPAs, that definitely gets my interest. So perhaps we can talk a little bit later on about SOC reporting and how that may interface with some of this, what we're talking about right now.
I'd love to have that conversation.
Thanks so much, Scott. I really appreciate it. Well, that'll do it for this installment of the Truth Series, where we strive to provide simple answers to complex questions. If you have any questions at all related to anything you've heard today in the digital or identity trust space, reach out to us on our website. Thank you.